Hello and a very warm welcome. The headlines at this hour. Japan's top government spokesman has blasted the Tokyo Electric Power Company for measuring inaccurate radiation readings at the troubled Fukushima nuclear power plant. Yukio Edano says the mistake is unacceptable. TEPCO had earlier announced that radiation levels of water at the number 2 reactor were 10 million times higher than usual, when it was in fact only 100,000 times the normal amount. TEPCO has since retracted the statement and apologized. Draining highly contaminated water is the top priority today at the plant. Contaminated water had accumulated in the basement of reactors 1 through 3 after a week of dousing the plant with water. The latest in the battle for Libya, coalition air raids have hit Muammar Gaddafi's birthplace of Sirte. Residents there said they heard several loud explosions in the city as aircraft flew overhead. A Libyan government spokesman said 3 civilians had been killed in the city's port. Unconfirmed reports that rebels had taken Sirte sparked celebrity gunfire overnight in their stronghold of Benghazi. They came as NATO took full command of their whole military operation in Libya. And those are the latest headlines at this hour. You're watching Channel News Asia. More evacuations in Japan's Fukushima prefecture as radiation levels reach harmful levels. Fears of a nuclear meltdown mount as an explosion hits a 3rd reactor. Japan formally seeks help from the United Nations Nuclear Agency. The crisis in Japan deals a blow to markets, not just in Tokyo, but across Asia. Hello, I'm Roshni. Welcome to the World Today. Japan's nuclear crisis has escalated after a blast and a fire rocked its quake-stricken Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Today's incident sent radiation in the area up to dangerous levels. Prime Minister Naoto Kan has vowed that the government would do all it can to deal with the situation. His chief spokesman announced the level at the plant was now high enough to endanger human health. The last remaining people within a 20-kilometer exclusion zone around the plant now have to leave, and that those living between 20 and 30 kilometers from the site have been told to stay indoors. A blast hit the number 2 reactor this morning. That was followed shortly after a fire which briefly broke out at the plant's reactor 4. It is also believed to have led to radioactive leaks. This means that 4 out of the 6 reactors at the facility are now in trouble. Plant operator Tokyo Electric Power says it has evacuated workers as a precaution. Only 50 workers remain at the plant to continue efforts to cool down the fuel rods. Japan has formally requested international assistance to prevent a nuclear catastrophe. It asked the United States for help in cooling the damaged nuclear reactors. Tokyo also asked the International Atomic Energy Agency to provide experts.
The question today that the Japanese authorities and the Japanese operators have to answer is how to best cool this reactor.
More on that. We are now joined by Professor Peter Hayes of the Nautilus Institute for Security and Sustainability. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Good afternoon, Roshni. Nice to be with you.
The International Atomic Energy Agency has been largely on the sidelines in this situation. Should they have played a larger role?
Well, the situation is that in the best case, we're going to have to shut down and probably decommission a number of those nuclear power plants, and the fuel that's in them, plus the fuel that's in the spent fuel ponds above or adjacent to the reactor on the reactor site, is all going to have to be moved off-site. Some of those reactors have molten fuel, and that's going to be very difficult to get out of the reactor pressure vessel. It's going to require all sorts of heavy lifting equipment, and some of those reactors, the heavy cranes, the overhead cranes, have actually been blown away in the explosions. So what will have to happen, this is the physical fact of the matter, whoever orchestrates it, whether it's the IAEA or some kind of ad hoc consortium or coalition, is that the United States, the Russians, and to some extent the Europeans, they're a bit further away, are going to have to provide a virtual armada of barges, heavy lifting helicopters, trained personnel to work alongside the Japanese to get the spent fuel out of the plants, onto barges, into dry cask storage, and then moved offshore away from dense population areas. And then they can figure out what to do with it after that while they put entomb, if you like, what's left of the reactors with some kind of impermeable concrete layer. That's what actually has to happen to probably at least 2 and possibly 5 of those reactors, on the assumption that they don't have any problems in the other reactors. Now, whether that's best done by the UN Security Council, whether it's best done on a bilateral basis, I don't know. But what I am almost certain of at this point, from what I know from my Japanese colleagues, is that this task actually exceeds the capacity of the Japanese government, and especially at a time when they're obviously overloaded in every respect with the recovery from the tsunami and the earthquake. They're going to need extensive international assistance, and this is not just going to take weeks. This is going to take months and years to fix.
Professor Hayes, if I could just take a look at the impact of what's happened. Japanese authorities say dose rates are up to 400 millisievert per hour. How dangerous is that?
At this point, that's actually a very small dose. In relative terms, from a public health perspective, it's not significant, but that's clearly because the containment building, the dome around the reactor, is still intact and has negative pressure, which means that the radiation that must be leaking from that spent fuel pond, depending on how much spent fuel was in it from past operation of the reactor, has been contained inside the building. That radiation will have to be somehow collected from inside the building and put into some kind of container. That's going to be extremely difficult to do. The probabilities are that it will slowly leak out over time, and there will be increased dosages downwind, and then it will be a question of luck as to which way the wind is blowing as to how much actual exposure there is. But, the short answer is people need to stay inside, not go outside, and they need to have iodine tablets at hand because of the risk to thyroids from some of the fissile materials that would be released in that circumstance. I'm sure the people will do warning and will evacuate as necessary.
Professor Hayes, authorities are evacuating everyone within a 20-kilometre radius. Those between 20 and 30 kilometres are being told to stay indoors. In your opinion, is enough being done?
I think that's the right precautionary stance, but I would be thinking about a much larger evacuation if a spent fuel pond with significant amounts of spent fuel is now on fire. It really depends on how much spent fuel is at that pond, and I actually don't know the answer to that. If it's a relatively small amount, then they may have already evacuated enough people. If, in fact, there's the loadings from maybe the last 10 or 15, 20, 30 years of that reactor's operational at that spent fuel pond, then they have a really big Chernobyl-like crisis on their hands, and that will require a much bigger evacuation.
Thank you very much, Professor Hayes, for your insight. That was Professor Peter Hayes of the Nautilus Institute for Security and Stability.
The world has spoken with one voice. We demand an immediate end to the violence against the civilians and full respect for their fundamental human rights.
A clear message from the United Nations as Libya is taken off the Human Rights Council. Pakistan Minorities Minister who had sought to reform the country's blasphemy law is shot dead in Islamabad. Beijing tightens its security as China's lawmakers gather for their annual plenary session. Hello, I'm Roshni. A very warm welcome to Asia Today. The United Nations has called for a mass evacuation of tens of thousands of people fleeing Libya for Tunisia. Its refugee agency says the situation at the border is at crisis point. The world body has suspended Libya from its Human Rights Council over Muammar Gaddafi's crackdown on protests. Meanwhile, the two U.S. warships are heading towards Libya as Western powers ponder possible military action. Unrest is also sweeping across parts of the Middle East, with crowds fired up by the success of popular uprisings that overthrew governments in Tunisia and Egypt. In Iran, security forces reportedly fired tear gas at anti-government protesters in Tehran. This amateur video is believed to show opposition protests in the city of Shiraz. Crowds can be seen chanting in the streets and waving their fists. Thousands are demanding the release of two key opposition leaders, Mir Hossein Mousavi and Med Karoubi. Their families say the men are detained in prison, but the government denies this, saying they're under house arrest. In Bahrain, some 500 demonstrators protested outside. In Pakistan, a group of gunmen have shot dead Pakistan's Minister of Minorities. Shahbaz Bhatti is a well-known critic of the country's blasphemy law and was the only Christian in Pakistan's cabinet. Mr. Bhatti was leaving his home when unknown gunmen sprayed his vehicle with bullets. He was shot dead when he arrived at a hospital in Islamabad. It was not immediately clear why Mr. Bhatti was killed, but Mr. Bhatti had received death threats after calling for changes to the controversial blasphemy law. The law holds a death sentence for anyone who insults Islam. Critics say it has been used to persecute minority faiths. Mr. Bhatti is the second senior official to be killed this year for challenging the blasphemy law. In January, the governor of Pakistan's Punjab province, Salman Taseer, was killed by his own security guard because he spoke out against the law. Japan calls an alarmingly high radiation reading mistake at the Fukushima plant unacceptable and confirms a partial meltdown in reactor number 2. Libyan rebels celebrate the apparent fall of Muammar Gaddafi's hometown Sirte with anti-aircraft fire into the night sky. Lawyers for former Khmer Rouge prison chief call for his release. They say Duke was only following orders when he oversaw the deaths of thousands of people in the late 1970s. Hello and a very warm welcome to Asia Today. I'm Roshni Karwal. Our top story at this hour. Japan's top government spokesman has blasted the Tokyo Electric Power Company for measuring inaccurate radiation readings at the troubled Fukushima nuclear power plant. Yukio Edano says the mistake is unacceptable. TEPCO had earlier announced that radiation levels of water at the number 2 reactor were 10 million times higher than usual, when it was in fact only 100,000 times more than the normal amount. TEPCO has since retracted the statement and apologized.
まさにこうした放射線の測定というのは、さまざまな安全確保のための大前提になるものでありますので、こうした間違いというのは決して許されるものではないというふうに思っております。
Draining highly contaminated water is the top priority today at the plant. Contaminated water had accumulated in the basement of reactors 1 through 3 after a week of dousing the plant with water. Radiation levels soared over the weekend, with the airborne radiation in reactor unit 2 measuring 1,000 millisieverts per hour, 4 times the limit deemed safe for the government. Authorities say it could have been caused by partially melted fuel rods over the weekend, but they've assured the public that radiation is mainly contained within the reactor building.